Humanistic psychology, the third force. Where to begin? Perhaps not with Rogers or Maslow or Charlotte Bueller or even Rollo May. You've all read or will soon be reading these dancing stars of the third force. But rather with William Carlos Williams' The Red Wheelbarrow, a poem which intimates attentiveness, the significance of the thing itself, encounter in the sense of Buber's I and thou. So much depends, because we ourselves witness the scene. Simple and concrete throughout, Williams' poem evokes simultaneously esoteric matters as well. The sheer mystery of being and things. No ideas, uses Williams, but in things. So let's begin with the poet as muse, not forgetting, however, the poetry of our own forebear, the immortal William James. Life is in the transitions as much as in the terms connected. Often it seems to be there more emphatically, as if our spurts and sallies forward were the real firing line of the battle, like the thin line of flame advancing across the dry autumnal field, which the farmer proceeds to burn. Now it's interesting to note the contrast between the stasis depicted in William Carlos Williams, though the image itself is strikingly evanescent, and the mercuriality, indeed ineffability, in the passage of James, in which life, like the endless and yet paradoxically time-bound stream of consciousness and events, cannot be curtailed or contained, or hence ever fully apprehended or grasped. A world of pure experience is a world of perpetual flux. We should note, too, that Williams once wrote an epic poem, Paterson, about Paterson, New Jersey, with repetitive evocations of the Passaic River, another image of perpetual change. If there's a God, could the young Bob Dylan, the river's hymn. Just a side note, this epic poem of William Carlos Williams, Paterson, was in fact the poem that inspired Robert Coles, the sort of saintly child psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, to enter into the field of child psychiatry. He had been a Harvard student as an undergraduate at here in Boston, Cambridge, and wrote an essay on Williams' poem, Paterson, and the professor was impressed enough with this young man that he cajoled him into sending a copy to William Carlos Williams, who was a practicing physician in New Jersey, in Paterson. And Williams writes back, not bad for a Harvard kid, and he invited him to meet at some time, and eventually they do, and it's really Williams who says at some point to Coles that if he had to do it again, he thinks he'd choose psychiatry, and Coles took this as a kind of message, and we should all read him. He's I often assign him in my courses because he's a beautiful writer, beautiful man. I've been fortunate to know him a little, and we needn't stick to just our own discipline. I think oughtn't do that. When you read him, he's terribly eclectic, and the best of our literature is also. Now I'm going to be making a play, as Coles will do, for the place of the arts in third force psychology and third force psychology. How can you have humanistic psychology devoid of the humanities. It seems like a non sequitur. And this is a photograph of a very, very close friend of mine, artist, who passed away in old age some years ago. And this is him, obviously, as a quite young man, as a youth, contemplating perhaps his future and what he might possibly make of it and of himself. And I want to have this sense of aesthetic possibility sort of underwrite this entire lecture. It's interesting to note that in my mind, the two bookends of greatness in psychology, William James and Rollo May, were both artists. William James studied art. Many people don't know this, but he studied art before entering into psychology. And Rollo May also was an amateur artist who took his art quite seriously through his life and writes about it in his book, My Quest for Beauty, and elsewhere. So then James and May, as respectively patron saint and perhaps poet of the third force. Rollo May wasn't technically a poet, but when you read through his books, the arch of his work, I think, has something profoundly poetic about it. So the third force, then, the genius, largesse, and modesty of William James, writing, teaching, lecturing furiously in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, even as a sort of vicious intellectualism, that's James's visceral coinage, associated with a severely narrow-minded epistemology, officially prevails. And then after the emergence of psychoanalysis and behaviorism at the turn of the century, those dynamic theorists of personality, Henry Murray, Gordon Allport, Gardner and Lois Murphy, godparents in effect, to us heirs to a hallowed legacy, each pointing in her or his respective way to the growth-oriented dimension in human nature. Interestingly, the most influential students of these precursors to the third force tended, in keeping with the spirit of the times, often to become card-carrying reductionists, while this growth-oriented dimension would, beginning in the late 50s and 60s, become the province of the existential, humanistic, transpersonal luminaries with whom we are so familiar and of whom we are rightly proud. Carl Rogers, Charlotte Bueller, Rollo May, Abraham Maslow, Anthony Sudich, to name some of the most foundational. The third force seeks at its most inspired to embrace the fuller range of human experience, from the subliminal to the transcendent, from the tragic to the triumphant, from the spotlight centers of consciousness to its most floodlit margins. A visionary psychology, in the words of the late Eugene Teller, that reaches out, in the words of James, to something more. Termites of reduction and beyond. Orthodoxy has always had difficulty comprehending that which lies outside its scope. Much of psychology is indeed empirically grounded. Something third force psychology is itself oftentimes reluctant to sufficiently acknowledge or see. Empiricism, however, remains one approach among many, and often is itself glaringly biased against reaching beyond familiar methodology and ground. James, in sketching out what he came to call radical empiricism, attempts in effect to replace the narrow metaphysic of empirical orthodoxy with one infinitely more broad and complex. He means to encourage perspective, not to discount science. To no type of mind is it given to discern the totality of truth, he writes. Something escapes the best of us, not accidentally but systematically, because we have a twist. James uses words like intensity and richness for our person-centered psychology, one in which new truths are not so much discoveries as inventions, stepping stones, in effect, on a route to something else. It's not science that troubles him, but the rote application of technique to unsuitable areas of inquiry, and the Procrustean elimination of everything outside its purview. Further, James points out that scientism's retreat from mystery belies a theism all its own, what we might call the deification of method. Science, in short, is selective and by no means neutral. The Jungian archetypal psychologist James Hillman, who, like Jung himself, always honored the centrality of James, once wrote, "The psychologist faces problems, and those problems are not merely classifiable events, not merely medical categories of disease. They are above all experiences and sufferings, problems with an inside. Experiences and sufferings, problems with an inside." Words echoing James's intensity and richness. So the problems associated with an empirical approach too narrowly defined, this is what the third force has always been rallying against. The tendency to want to reduce the whole into the component parts. The psychologist's fallacy, states James, which doggedly mistakes map for territory. By way of contrast, we might bear in mind the Taoist wisdom of Lao Tzu and Zhengzi. Ironists like Zhengzi or Alan Watts are always ridiculing our fanatical attempts to pin things down, though neither has anything here in James. We can make this story, or try to make this point rather, with a story out of I think it's out of Irvin Yalom's volume on existential psychotherapy, and I think there he tells a story of Viktor Frankl's, of two men quarreling in the old country, one man accusing the other's cat of having eaten its butter. And so the fight becomes heated, and they eventually take it down to the village wise man, probably the local Rebbe, who hears the story and scratches his chin, or perhaps sidelocks, and says to the first man, "How much did your cat weigh?" And how much butter did you lose? I'm sorry. And the man says exactly 10 pounds. And so he takes the other man's cat, puts it on a scale, and it weighs exactly 10 pounds. So the Rebbe says, "Well, here we have the butter. Now where the hell is the cat?" Throughout the literature of the third force, then, we attend the place of movement, narrative, becoming and decay, emergence and disappearance. In a word, evanescence. There are no fixtures in nature, writes Emerson in his Taoist-sounding essay, Circles. The universe is fluid and volatile. Permanence is but a word of degrees. Our globe seen by God is a transparent law, not a mass of facts. The law dissolves the fact and holds it fluid. So against systems, against reductionism, place of literature, the place of art. They spell out here, as you can see, transcriptions of reality from translations of ancient Chinese. Instead of quietly reading the original text of their own lives and responsibilities. To them, the day before yesterday seems more accessible than today. But reality is never and nowhere more accessible than in the immediate moment of one's own life. All it guarantees us is what is superficial, the facade. One must break through this, then everything becomes clear. But how does one do that? How does one proceed? Is there some sure guide? No, there is none, said Kafka, shaking his head. There is no route map on the way to truth. The only thing that counts is to make the venture of total dedication. A prescription would already imply withdrawal amid trust, and therewith the beginning of a false path. One must accept everything patiently and fearlessly. Man is condemned to life, not death. And this is an astonishing passage from a book called Conversations with Kafka. Janak was a young, aspiring writer who really never succeeded as a writer, who knew Kafka as a youth. Kafka was in his 30s at the time, and they became friendly for some years, and Janak would often visit him in his office. They would stroll around the streets of Prague. On this particular occasion, he takes to Kafka in his office a German volume of the Tao Te Ching, which the ancient Chinese text, which most of you probably know, and certainly all of you will know eventually, and excitedly shows it to Kafka, who's less than impressed. He kind of fingers the book, and looks at it, and then sort of hands it back and says these terribly eloquent words. What's striking, well, first of all, the sheer eloquence of it all. He's just thinking out loud. But in commenting on this, what he essentially is doing is telling the younger man exactly what that German translation of the Tao Te Ching, which everybody in the German-speaking world in Prague is talking about, is contained in that book. Because the Tao Te Ching is really saying essentially the same things that Kafka is saying to his young friend. A world of pure experience, in other words, precisely what Lao Tzu points to as well. So the third force then seeks to say a few words about the cat, about the fuller range of human experience and possibility. It aspires at its best to hit upon all the notes along the spectrum of being, from the tragic points of view with which many people wrongly, exclusively associate existential perspectives, to the relational largesse of Rogers or Buber, or even in Dalai Lama, and on to the transcendent domains, especially identified with, though not exclusively circumscribed by, the transpersonal psychology originally of Maslow, Sudich, and Stanislav Grof. The third force, in its most rarefied guise, does not dispense with science, but rather points to the larger truth, that science itself is ultimately dependent upon metaphysics. James, for example, decries the systematic denial of science on science's part of personality as a condition of events. And so, the third force as a person-centered psychology. EHTP psychology, E for existence, absurdity revisited. For life is at the start a chaos in which one is lost. The individual suspects this, but he is frightened at finding himself face to face with this terrible reality and tries to cover it over with a curtain of fantasy where everything is clear. It does not worry him that his ideas are not true. He uses them as trenches for the defenses of his existence, as scarecrows to frighten away reality. Sortea y Geset, from an essay beautifully entitled In Search of Goethe from Within. Ortega was a well-known Spanish philosopher, sometimes called existential philosopher, who wrote famously a kind of dark world called Revolt of the Masses. But you can see how he speaks to the absurdity of existence here. What Heidegger calls throwness. You know that passage out of Jim Morrison, into the world we're thrown like a dog without a bone. And this is a beautiful collage. My friend John's, my artist friend, John Urbane was his name. He attended Black Mountain College in the 50s, which was in its day a very, very special and famous place. All sorts of avant-garde thinkers and artists were there. Joseph Albers, the artist, Merce Cunningham, dancer, Buckminster Fuller, the thinker. And my friend eventually studied with Albers and eventually went on to become a wonderful abstract artist. And you can see here this collage in which you can see the human figure down below common in his work, and a kind of abode, that square, brownish, rectangular, I should say, structure, which would be a kind of house or lean-to, never overly substantial. In other words, the human being is always exposed to the elements, which you can see depicted above, the celestial bodies and the great expanse. Where it was, I shall return. That's Otto Rank's reformulation of Freud, courtesy of Bob Kramer. Bob is along with Jim Lieberman, his friend and our friend. These are really the great Rankian scholars of our time. Where it was, I shall return. Freud said famously, where it was, I shall be. Rank, however, so Freud's pointing to mastery. Rank, however, is pointing to something beyond mastery. He's saying no matter what we master, we're always returning, to the all in the end. And Beckett makes this point quite poetically in his famous play, Waiting for Godot. The light gleams an instant, then it's night once more. Now, On the topic of absurdity, I want to talk in the briefest way about two irremediable givens of existence: anxiety and despair. And I don't want to talk about them objectively or symptomatically, but rather experientially, existentially, phenomenologically, how they are subjectively experienced by the poor, bare, forked animal. The poor, bare, forked animal, that would be us, about which Shakespeare writes. Each of these states of heart and mind underwrites a host of psychological, physical, and indeed psychospiritual conditions that comprise the work of psychotherapy. Even more, they are experiential states with which we are all, consciously or otherwise, both personally and intimately acquainted. Anxiety. Two profound thinkers on the topic, and you can read them while I'm speaking. Rollo May used to like to tell the story that as a young man he had been stricken with tuberculosis and spent some time in the sanitarium, interrupting his studies. He was hospitalized in upstate New York, and he did not know whether he would make it or not. And he kept reading over and over again the two books that were then published on the subject of anxiety, one by Freud and one by Kierkegaard. And he said in the end that Freud knew about anxiety, but that Kierkegaard knew anxiety. And he eventually recovered, in his mind due to an act of will, and returned to his studies, and his dissertation was eventually published as The Meaning of Anxiety, which is quite Kierkegaardian in its sweep, in its understanding of anxiety. The poet Auden labeled the modern epoch the age of anxiety. Leonard Bernstein, wrote a major symphony, a second, by the same name. We can easily see it as the central problem of the 20th century and arguably the 21st century as well, reflected in our best art, film, literature, and music. It's worth stating here that both James and May were both turbulent souls, and the profundity of these thinkers, I think, comes from the fact that they immerse themselves not only in anxiety but in despond as well. As Kierkegaard writes someplace, the greater the dread, the greater the human being. Anxiety, according to May, is the central problem of psychotherapy, awareness of which is actually augmented by the therapeutic experience. The normal anxiety of life can't be avoided except at the price of apathy or the numbing of one's sensibilities and imagination. And then there is Otto Rank, the genius in Freud's circle, as Rollo himself said on his deathbed. And for Rank, all of life was a kind of vacillation between life and death anxiety, a fear of moving out and a fear of being caught within, being caught too far within So, the meaning of anxiety. Despair, or what Churchill, who was prone to despair or depression, called his black dog. The ubiquity of human suffering is a point to which we've already implied. Even journeying to the east, if we can quote Hess, or the stars, will not take it completely away. Read, for example, William Styron's Darkness Visible. Watch almost anything by Ingmar Bergman. The Seventh Seal, for example, or Through a Glass Darkly. The late Bay Area psychoanalyst Alan Wheelis, as existential and humanistic as they come, once put it this way: it's part of being human. We differ from one another only in more or less. A few tranquil ones with little conflict suffer less. At the extreme stretched by despair to some dreadful cracking point, one goes berserk. In between are the rest of us, not miserable enough to go mad or jump off the bridge, yet never able, if we are honest, to say that we've come to terms with life, are at peace with ourselves, that we are happy. So this is what James calls the worm at the core. Still, lest we fall prey to the common prejudice of equating suffering with negativity, let me point out that our story's just begun. Also, to be honest, I do not know any more inspirational and uplifting spirits in our field than William James and Rollo May, both of whom were subject to periods of profound despond. Maslow also deserves mention here. And so, the ubiquity of suffering, something all the great psychologists have always known. Freud himself spoke of neurotic misery being transformed into common unhappiness. The underappreciated Alfred Adler speaks of problems in living. Alan Wheelis, problems in being. And Otto Rank writes of the human being as a suffering being, a theological thing in need of vindication from beyond. Among all my patients in the second half of life, Jung once famously quipped, there is not one whose principal problem is not a religious one. So then, life as a journey, as metamorphosis, turbulence. EHTP, Becoming Human or Rebellion. This collage, inspired by my friend's Black Island existence, was made on an unfinished door. And you can see the ocean in the background, or at least I can, knowing my friend's work, and again, the human abode, always a little insubstantial, suggesting that really a little human kindness or communion would be helpful. By the way, the second terms in each of these three sections, we're going to look at EHT, come from Camus. Camus was a great humanistic thinker, and as a young man in his 20s, really wrote out beforehand his life's work. He sort of sketched out what it would be. The first stage was going to be absurdity, that is to say, we are thrown into a world without having been asked, that defies explication. And This is what he calls absurdity. Read The Myth of Sisyphus, read his novel, L'étranger, The Stranger, and you will get some idea for what he is talking about. The second stage is one of rebellion. Read The Rebel, his essay, or read, read especially his novel during this period called The Play. If our existence is initially absurd, there is the possibility of rebelling against that absurdity and making something meaningful of it. And for the third phase of Camus' work, well, we'll wait just a moment. There seems to be no agent more effective than another person in bringing a world for oneself alive, or by a glance, a gesture, or a remark, shriveling at the reality in which one is lodged. Irving Goffman. Goffman is a very well-known sociologist, and you come across this passage in several of R.D. Laing's books. It meant a lot to Laing, and it means a lot to some of us too. A great relationship breaches the barriers of a lofty isolation, subdues its strict law, and throws a bridge from self-being to self-being across the abyss of dread of the universe. A beautiful, beautiful passage by Buber. What's lovely about this passage is the way in which the existential, the humanistic, that is to say relational, and also the cosmic commingle. He talks about dread, he talks about the universe, he talks about great relationship, all in a terribly moving and concise sentence, just a single sentence. Above, there's a drawing made by a client of mine. I worked for many years with a young woman who, was bona fide multiple personality, what we would call officially dissociative identity. I actually write about her story in a book called Ethics and Lao-Tzu, which I wrote some years ago, and it's a story that is sort of astonishing, almost hard to believe, and heartrending as well. And here, it's just a very simple image of two rowboats that are adjacent to another, and a third larger boat, which seems to be out of the picture. It was actually a photograph she took and then turned into a drawing. And she gave me copies of both and told me that it reminded her of psychotherapy, of our work together, because for the first time she felt that she was, along with me, she was the main act, and we were in this together, and it was the first time in her life when she wasn't the sort of odd woman out. So you can see how this visual expression gets just at what Goffman and Buber are talking about. Honoring life's human as opposed to transcendent dimension. When I was young, I expected people to give me more than they could: continuous friendship, permanent emotion. Now I have learned to expect less than they can give. a silent companionship, and their emotions, their friendship, and noble gestures keep their full miraculous value in my eyes. Holy the fruit of grace. This is beautiful passages from Camus' notebooks, honoring the human dimension, as he puts it, as opposed to the transcendent. It's important, I think, that we not think about existential, humanistic, and transpersonal dimensions or perspectives as sort of improvements one upon the other. Rather, they all commingle with the best third force literature. And again, I point toward writers like May and precursors like James to get an idea of what I'm talking about. The best of our work doesn't separate out. And you find this in the arts as well. The unseen. This same young woman in the literature, I called her Christina, I would get emails from time to time by an unseen, that is to say, unnamed group of alters that never came forward in the sessions, but would just rather write to me from time to time, always poems, short, evocative poems. We want to find neighbors in the universe, but we don't know the names of the neighbors next door. You see how this dovetails with these passages we've just come across by Camus. And then a different idea that really begins to bring us into the transpersonal. Nothing holds me, writes Kafka in his diary. Doors and windows open, terraces broad and empty. Transcendence, or cosmic consciousness. Camus calls it love. My friend during this period of his life was gathering up old leather-bound books, not to read, but rather to use these leather covers and turn them into collages. And here once again we see at the bottom that white figure with the red head, the frail human specimen, and the kind of insubstantial home or abode for protection, and then of course the wide expanse. You can look at it and see a kind of thrownness or anxiety there, bewilderment perhaps before the greater world. But you can also see here, in Jamesian terms, the relationship of the human being to the cosmic and to the divine. We bathe in an atmosphere traversed by spiritual currents. Many resist, but others open themselves wide and thus allow themselves to be influenced by these wide, beneficent breezes. Henri Bergson, he writes this in the preface, I think, to the French translation of William James' Pragmatism. And then a passage from, again, my client, Christina, the inner guide, and without going into much detail, dissociative identities, as their lives begin to become more and more problematic, there's often one individual who begins to rise to the forefront to try to keep things organized. And she never bears the given name of the person, because that person is always seen as incompetent. And she, the inner guide, is the one that tries to really do her damnedest to stay alive, to keep everything together. And she's the one who working with often in psychotherapy as well. I just got this email one day, and it was entitled or captioned parallax, which from the Greek means alteration or to change. That is to say, a shift in perspective or consciousness. It is to those states between waking and sleep that we find ourselves most attuned. The greater meaning is found here, wandering aimlessly, pushing forward to the realm of reality and back toward the realm of mystery. Only a thin layer of consciousness lies between the two, yet they remain forever separated. Sometimes experienced only in dreams, other times glimpsed through revelation, these veiled understandings lurk behind the shadows of our minds, waiting patiently for the quietness of the physical, for the movement of the spiritual. It is a purposeful direction which mocks human preoccupancy with order, logic, and reason, aligning itself solely with comprehension at the awakening of awareness. Well, this is an astonishing passage, and it makes us all wish we could write like this about a very esoteric matters, very subtle states of consciousness, precisely the sorts of things that James and Bergson are pointing to. It's interesting in the book that I wrote, there was an official review. The reviewer, who I didn't know, I know he is now, he's a bright guy, completely missed this, the narrative of the book. I really didn't take up this extraordinary story at all. And I think because there was a kind of difficulty in really appreciating that a young woman who was so terribly traumatized, after all, she'd been hospitalized 60 or 80 times. I tell part of that story there in that book. I was also capable of this kind of awareness, of this kind of eloquence that we professionals really can only admire, of unusual empathy, humor, creativity. It's an astonishing story, and I found myself corresponding with Coles, to whom I dedicated the book, who took a great interest in it. My artist friend took a great interest in her story. Also Alan Willis, to whom I sent a copy. It's important, I think, that we psychologists are able to really appreciate stories that overwhelm us. The exceptional occurrence, William James talks somewhere about white crows. He says, in order to prove that all crows are not black, one needn't prove that none of them are, but rather that only one is white. And there was a famous medium in Concord. At the time, that is to say late 19th century, her name was Lenora Piper. And he had spent a lot of time with her, as many others did as well, and he understood that there were things that happened there, things that she could speak to about other people, that she had no way, that is to say, no reasonable way of knowing, no logical way. And he was able to take all of this in. My white crow, he said famously, is Lenora Piper, and I would say my white crow has been Christina. James emphasizes his enduring interest in the subconscious, and in its exploration as a doorway to the awakening of mystical religious experience. Further, he defines religion as, quote, the feelings, acts, and experiences of individuals in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to the divine. Finally, he cautions, always the circumspection in James, against what he calls theopathic absorption, getting stuck on only the upper wavelengths. The third force must embrace diversity in more than just words. Lewis Hoffman, I should say, wrote a corrective review of my book. Well, he published it, but bless his heart, he was able to get much more into the story than the official reviewer, and that speaks well to character. Scraps, orts, fragments, the flowing, the fluidity, the spectral moments of being. Virginia Woolf, these are phrases out of her novel, To the Lighthouse. So here too the place of art, Nietzsche's boundary points, where one stares into that which defies illumination. James calls it the void beyond, with art as protection and remedy. In other words, when you stare into the void, you need art as remedy. In the modern world, Pound and Rilke observed that our artists would carry the world's spiritual codes. So once again, the indispensability of art. The world is really malleable, writes James, waiting to receive its final touches at our hands. Beautiful. James writes about what he calls the aesthetic motive. The world is really malleable, waiting to receive its final touches at our hands. And famously, Nietzsche writes about self-creation, the rarest and most difficult art. And these are lovely passages that talk about just this, the creative act, out of Woolf's novel, To the Lighthouse. So it's worth noting here that Maslow's final stage of development was one of self-transcendence, while bearing in mind his observation that self-actualization could, even in the best of us, only be relatively achieved. I remember recently seeing an interview with a well-known British humanistic psychologist, and he was talking about how he had been immersed in the field for quite a long time and had become completely self-actualized and even a little bored until he got turned on to the work of one of the quite well-known transpersonal writers. and then a whole new realm opened up for him. But personally, when I read or hear something like this, I just think to myself, what does it mean to be completely self-actualized? This is a misunderstanding of things, and indeed, it's not something that Maslow himself would ever say, or Virginia Woolf would ever say. I can recall my artist friend. One day we were driving around in his car on Block Island off of Rhode Island, and he was talking about some interaction with an aspiring artist who talked about herself or himself as being repeatedly as being so creative, and my friend said, artists don't talk like that. This is the way artists talk. Art flies around truth, writes Kafka, but with the definite intention of not getting burnt. Its capacity lies in finding in the dark void a place where the beam of light can be intensely caught without this having been perceptible before. Kafka. Tarkovsky was one of the great Russian filmmakers. Art, like science, is a means of assimilating the world, an instrument for knowing it in the course of man's journey toward what is called absolute truth. Art could be said to be a symbol of the universe, being linked with that absolute spiritual truth, which is hidden from us in our positivistic, pragmatic activities. We possess art, thus we perish of the truth. Friedrich Nietzsche. This photograph was taken by Christina. Of her children. She took it when they were walking over a footbridge and spontaneously began to hold hands. And Christina told me that it reminded her of therapy once again. She said, that you cannot tell, but the stream underneath was sort of rough on this day, and the skies were overcast, and she said there was a sense evoked in this image of not quite knowing where you were going, but nonetheless no longer being alone. Step out of your cave. The world awaits you like a garden, writes Nietzsche. All things want to be your physicians. The ultimate paradox is that negation becomes affirmation. Ralome. So again, the admixture of elements, the existential, humanistic, transpersonal. We draw new life from the heroic example. The prophet has drunk more deeply than anyone of the cup of bitterness, but his countenance is so unshaken, and he speaks such mighty words of cheer that his will becomes our will, and our life is kindled at his own. Now, who else but James would write that in a textbook of psychology? And always we're talking about character. Self-creation, writes Nietzsche, the most difficult art. With a sudden intensity, as if she saw it clear for a second, She drew a line there in the center. It was done, it was finished. Yes, she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue. I have had my vision. Virginia Woolf to the Lighthouse. And here is my friend's final art exhibit. The lovely gallery in Maine. There had been a period in his later years where, when he had attended a show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and taken in the art of medieval Siena in Italy, not far from Florence, a beautiful medieval town, or a place that once you've been to, you don't really forget. And he came home and he sort of projected into some of the art he had seen, images from his own life, and he would often put photographs so you can't quite tell here of his own family members, significant people in his own life into these collages. And you can see, if you look on the walls behind, all the work that was displayed at this show. Like the character in Woolf's novel, he had had his vision. And there he is, not long before death, now an old man, but we might hope with some sense that he had lived his life as he should, or as Beckett said, that he had kept his appointment. This guy truly did. And a beautiful quote by Robert Coles, taken from The Spiritual Life of Children. Read Coles. Read Coles. Summing up then, third force psychology speaks to an expansive approach to our work, one marked by subtlety and nuance, and which encompasses what the Czech writer Milan Kundera calls a spirit of complexity. The proper metaphor, perhaps, is that of music. The late string quartets of Beethoven, or the recordings of Coltrane, if jazz is your thing, in which various parts continually interpenetrate, weaving in the end a kind of harmony between contending visions and sounds, the subjective, experiential, the interpersonal, collective, and finally the transcendent, spiritual. The third force attempts to make the case for what Mary Catherine Bateson has called the embrace of multiplicity, the pluralism which James exhorted long ago. Once again, it is, as our own Eugene Taylor kept admonishing, a visionary psychology. As great a scientist as Darwin confided in old age that he regretted the manner in which he had lived, that if he had a chance to do it over again, he would add a little poetry every day, as his emotional life is atrophied from lack of use. My mind, he wrote, seems to have become a machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts. This loss of these aesthetic tastes is for me a loss of happiness. So one last time we make a plea for the aesthetic domains, something I've been lobbying for here throughout. Darwin's contemporary, Herman Melville, put it even more succinctly. Science lights, but cannot warm. In the end, third force psychology exhorts that we grow up and into our loftier selves. Bar should be set very high. We are all human, may his revered teacher, Henry Stack Sullivan, liked to say. Some of us more so. Fringed by amour, exhorts our own patron saint, William James, echoing through those retreating corridors of time.